So you originally outlined the model as risky before you got involved with it. Why was that? What did you think?
Well, I think there's a whole series of elements to it. One, the fact you've got a single person and a single relationship with the chief constable. There's always the danger that, how does a single person represent a diverse community, particularly the size of the West Midlands, 2.8 million people with hundreds of languages spoken. But secondly, of course, a single person, whether they represent a political party or an individual, is always likely to be able to have allegations that they're looking after a particular vested interest, which clearly wouldn't be possible through a collective cross-party organisation with independence along the lines of the old police authority.
Definitely, and but you were still keen to get involved.
Well, I think accountability for policing, ensuring we support and scrutinise our policing, is absolutely crucially important. That's a vital role. I think this is a particularly poor way of doing it, but it still needs to be done.
Okay, and after 1 year, what effect has the introduction of the PCCs actually, have we benefited from having PCCs, or have we?
I would think on the whole, we've seen a slight movement backwards in terms of key achievements of the role. And I've done a detailed analysis. In terms of Theresa May's concept of the fact that she believes the only thing you should judge is whether you reduce crime or not, if we judge it on that particular basis, and I don't think the Police and Crime Commissioners are solely responsible for the impact on crime, it's a much more complicated picture than that, but her own criteria, since April, when the plans and the budgets that the Police and Crime Commissioners have set, we've seen 3 decades of ever reducing crime grind to a halt, with a majority of police forces are showing increases in crime.
Yeah, and with your school report style, why did you think that was a good style to analyse? Did it just set it out perfectly to have the 4 out of 10, 7 out of 10s?
I think it's a nice, simple technique that people actually have had to experience, either had a good experience of or a bad experience of, but most people have experienced that. And I think it's a very concise way of looking at the key roles of the Police and Crime Commissioner and assessing my view as to how they're successful have been, and then providing the evidence to support that view.
And then some of those key roles you've looked at is, for example, the public confidence. Do you feel that there's been certain scandals or certain questionable affairs that PCCs have had that haven't benefited public confidence as they should have?
Well, certainly there's been more investigations of PCCs, there's been more disputes with chief constables appearing on the front pages than ever appeared in the whole of the lifetime of the police authorities. So I think you can score PCCs highly for getting lots more profile and publicity. However, much of that publicity and profile has been for areas that aren't necessarily going to improve the confidence of the community.
Would you say that the PCCs have kind of been grouped or into the collective of politicians and therefore have got quite bad media from being politicians rather than being?
Well, clearly anyone who stands for election is a politician, so we are politicians where politics has been injected into policing for good or ill. I think the problem is, in terms of offering that assurance to the community that police are being held to account on behalf of everybody, it is much more difficult to get that narrative across when you're a single person than when you used to be a body which had members of all political parties on it and respected independence as well, with a breadth of experience.
So before there was the 4 main bodies, weren't there, that made up the police authority, but now it's just the 1 independent. Why do you think it was that? Was it downsizing, or was it just?
Well, the government had this view that they felt that the old police authorities were invisible and discredited. Though it is quite interesting, if you look up and down the country, including Hampshire, the majority of people elected are actually people associated with the old discredited invisible regime. So clearly some people out there actually felt they had done a good job and voted for them on that particular basis. But I do find it very strange, because I've experienced policing going back to the mid-80s, and the last major change in terms of the 1994 Police and Magistrates Court Act was on the basis there was too many high-profile clashes between majority political police authorities and chief constables, and it was undermining confidence. Though for that reason they brought in the new police authorities, where it was impossible to get a political majority on the basis this would provide assurance. So what Parliament thought was absolutely essential in 1994. Come 2010, come 2011, Parliament has voted through something which says the opposite. We want that high-profile one, and let's not worry about these high-profile clashes with chief constables and others. It seems to be a complete reversal of the position over a couple of decades.
So is it therefore Parliament's model that they've brought about, or is it the individuals of police and crime commissioners like yourself? Were you fighting a losing battle?
Well, I think there's two elements to it. Clearly, there is the national framework, which you can only still be a single person. There are elements within it, of course, where you can limit the damage, you can hold the tide back, and hopefully push the tide a bit faster. So you can make a difference at the edges, but obviously the intrinsic nature of the post presents some difficulties that you cannot avoid. You can't avoid being a single elected person. But there are ways to try and mitigate the damage. I've set up a cross-party policing and crime board, which again reflects the very diverse communities that we actually serve. I've devolved local plans and resources to local cities and boroughs, where we have a Coventry policing plan, a Birmingham policing plan, set by a Birmingham policing and crime board, a Coventry policing and crime board, which is a majority representing the people of that particular area. So I've brought about devolution, which also has the advantage, of course, is those boards are not able to be described as having political dominance. They are reflective of the whole of that particular community, and politicians of no party form a majority on any of them.
You keep mentioning the single elected body, but the elections had a really low turnout. Do you feel, therefore, that although it was an election, it was kind of just pushed through?
Certainly, I may say clearly, I think the electorate didn't vote with their feet. In fact, some recent statistics indicate that the number of people who actually went to a polling station was only 5%, and the rest have been postal votes who acquire those postal votes for previous general elections or local elections. I think very few acquired the postal votes to actually have the privilege of voting in the police and crime commission election. I think that's a clear sign that this is not a popular, the reintroduction of politics into policing is not a popular move. I don't think the majority of people saw the need to spend £100 million on introducing a new politician when you were losing police officers. People do want high visible policing, they don't want high visibility politicians.
So would you say that it was a lack of public awareness or just that it was an unpopular decision?
I think a combination of both. I may say it was a fairly unpopular decision, which I think the lack of voting and the fact that people voted for this supposedly discredited old invisible police authority members. But I also think if you wanted to organise an election, it's a way to actually maximise the number of people abstaining, then holding it in November with appalling publicity and not having a free mail-out, which every other election of a national basis does, then frankly is the way to actually ensure that you get the lowest possible turnout.
Yeah, and on that note, this is now the anniversary of the first elections, and everyone's had is 1 year on. Do you think that we're going to see this model through to another election, or do you think it's going to be reformed before?
Well, I think it's going to be very difficult for any incumbent government with a fixed term to be able to change anything in a year, which I hope is an advantage, because I do think what we really want to do is try and look at the model and try and find a model that has some degree of consensus, because policing is too important to be having a continual change of the governance and accountability structure. Hopefully a Royal Commission or some other arrangement could actually try and get to a situation where we can have a form of accountability that has the support and consensus of the vast majority of people, so we're not going to see it changed at every election.
We spoke earlier about how Theresa May admits that there were problems with the model, and she gave a speech calling it the warts and all that she was going to discuss. Do you think the high-level profiles of Theresa May as the Home Secretary does trickle down to the levels of the PCCs and to the Chief Constables? Are they going to take note of this and try and change for the future?
Well, I'm not quite sure that her description seemed very much a fairly desperate attempt to defend the indefensible. And frankly, if you wanted to have warts at all, my school report gives evidence where there's a lot more warts than she identified. In fact, some of the warts she suggested were actually, in my opinion, positive signs of police and crime commissioners not indulging in political grandstanding and actually standing up for the rights of individuals and the rights of their police services in which they represented.
Our local representative down in Hampshire, Simon Hayes, the policing commissioner there, has commented saying that your analysis is a one-size-fits-all and it doesn't take into account local levels, so whereas Hampshire might be doing well, but on a national level it's low. Do you think it does differ locally?
I think there are people who are having a different impact in different areas, and people have got different models, some of which are more effective than others, obviously. I defend my own model as one which has enabled us to move around the bear traps and not fall into as many as others. But it is about identifying the impact of the model rather than the impact of individuals. And clearly, nobody's going to get up in the morning saying, I'm going to make a mess of this on behalf of my community. They're all trying hard, as were the previous police authorities. But I do think the police authorities were able to actually take things forward in a much more managed way, where we have the greater confidence of the community. I'm not convinced that the new model has meant that you're able to take the community with you to the same degree as the previous model did.
Okay, and finally, overall, you gave the model 4 out of 10, and that you mentioned in the analysis that it was because it was £100 million spent for basically making police accountability less effective. How did that come around, and why just 4 out of 10? Why not higher?
Well, I think in terms of the evidence I actually suggested, in terms of all the key roles, be it setting the budget, setting of the plans, appointment of chief constable, dismissal of the chief constables, we see evidence of a much weaker position with much less confidence in that role by the community. Now, I think that's a reasonable objective assessment, and as someone who's been involved in policing governance since the mid-80s, I feel I'm able to make a comparative judgment. So there is subjective elements to it, but I would have thought there is considerable evidence, and I haven't seen anybody complaining about the objective evidence, which is incontrovertible and to a much greater magnitude than any other policing governance system that we've ever had before.
Okay, well, thank you very much for talking to us today, Bob.
It's a pleasure.
And I hope everything does go well in the future and that the model does reform or whichever way to make it better.
Well, I'm hoping that we might be able to get a better model where we can have the sort of scrutiny and support to our police services that has the confidence of the much wider section of the community than this particular model clearly doesn't, and the elections and the turnout of the elections clearly indicate that.
Thank you very much. All good?